Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Chicago. Did everyone have a great time yesterday with Marsha Davies, with the Empower? Yes. Talk about real conversations, real work disruptors. It's phenomenal to have that. So thank you very much for Marsha for coming and talking, bringing the MBA Empower to our event. Welcome to Chicago. As I mentioned yesterday, for those who weren't here, we are in the only standing club that survived the 1870 fires, and it was housed for the government for many years to rebuild the city. So there are no heaters in here, except 2 boilers, if you haven't found out already. And this is one of the historical buildings, with the room here and the room on the mixer we had downstairs. So I'm very honored to be here, and one of the reasons I came is because not only the history, but the fact they have incredible food here, so I'm happy about that. Too many times we hear that, right? So anyway, I'm Desiree Patno. I'm the CEO and the president of the Women in Housing and Real Estate Ecosystem. Why the new name? To better facilitate more immediate thought of industries that we are not. We are entering our 10th year, and so proud of the growth we've had this year. It is very fitting that we have it here because it's the very first time we are advancing the resources for women's poverty, home ownership, business owners, leadership, multifamily to family offices, all in one venue. It has never been done before in any venue across the United States. We are proud to have produced our 2018 Women in Housing Ecosystem Report. We released it in 2 volumes this year. Volume 1, State of the Women's Homeownership, and Volume 2, the Women in the Housing and Real Estate Ecosystem. It has 53 resources. We are proud to say we already have 10 more for 2019 to add to those 53 resources in a matter of 2.5 months. So we're very excited about that. With so many women's groups, conversations about gender equality, why NAWRB? Yesterday we had our Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Council and board committee meetings to answer that very question. We came up with a value proposition that we have incredible leadership in such a broad spectrum of related industries, that leveraging our respective resources and reach between us, we already are seeing an impact in driving quality change. Each one of us are very passionate, have had journeys and experiences that have really driven us to advance women's independence for the future. I'd like to take the time now to thank our sponsors, Freddie Mac, US Bank, Exit, Landy Insurance, Virtua Partners, Douglas Elliman, Empower from MBA, EarnUp, and several others. I also want to thank our strategic partners that are a yearly commitment to Exit Realty, Landy Insurance, HFS, Freddie Mac, and Fannie Mae, and VRM. I don't know what happened to that. You became very VRM in my computer. Also, there have been one speaker that has been to every single conference. Do I see him out here? And he's a guy. Victor Christensen, please stand. He is from the FDIC, and every single one for the last 5 years, he has come to our conference. This is the first time we've had it outside of California for our annual. We've had semi in DC, but never outside the state. So thank you, Victor. Also, I would like to thank the continued support, obviously, for the OMWIs and what they do, and are being supportive of our publications. So you notice in our magazine for the last couple of years, they have had their OMWI support in there. I also would like to take the time to acknowledge our incredible NDLC and board members. So if everyone could please rise that sits on the NDLC and is on a board. Thank you very much. These women work tirelessly behind the scenes. Some of us texting at 1, 2, 3 in the morning. I'm not exaggerating. And sometimes multiple times a day and even minutes. And also, we like to take the opportunity to have this amazing conference lineup and really want everyone to take full ownership of connecting. Our shirts and bags have on and say, "Be a disruptor." All disruptors are innovators, yet not all innovators are disruptors. We are honored today to have Dr. Chichadora as our She Centerfold, co-creator of over 45 patents, former IBM fellow, and an AI visionary, and has an infectious smile, and laughing you'll see it today. Trust me, check it out. She is the face of our latest trademark, Technology Human Balance, and you'll be hearing her shortly. Included in your bags is a resource material to prep you for the panel of Investing in the Opportunity Act. It is part of the tax reform and is evolving as we speak. So the beautiful thing about that is it's really going to help, in my personal opinion and several others in this room, to help the LMI and help the government and help the impact of our communities. So it's being brought to you in a format that is not traditional in a format like this, but this is where we all connect and get this done. So I'm very honored to have that. And finally, for this morning, we have our keynote speaker, who is the First Lady of Illinois, Diane Medley-Runner, and she's the president of Ounce of Prevention Fund, and you're all invited to treat for her. So thank you again for showing up, begin engaged, and building relationships. So I want to honor and welcome Sharron Levine, who is the Director of the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion at the Federal Housing Finance Agency. She's responsible for the oversight of diversity inclusion programs at the FHFA's regulated entities, which include Fannie, Freddie, and the Levine Federal Home Loan Banks and Office of Finance. She also is a She Centerfold from 4.5 years ago. Welcome. It's a true honor and friend to have her on the stage, and she's going to talk about something a little different. So thank you and welcome.
Good morning. I came prepared with technology, with paper, pen. Given the, I do apologize. This is rather loud, isn't it? Or it's okay? It's fine? Okay. Given the travel woes that I've had to endure over the last couple days, I figured that I wouldn't take a chance because technology would definitely go wrong. In any event, after a 6 or 7 hour delay of my flight on Saturday, which I eventually gave up, I got to the hotel. It was about 6 o'clock. Your room's not ready. It was just unbelievable. I did, however, end up with 4,000 bonus American Airlines miles, a free bottle of wine from the hotel, and a $50 credit. So I'm good. Haven't opened the wine yet, but I think after this I'll just go back and do that. So thank you for inviting me, Desiree. It's always a pleasure here to be among such inspiring women and Victor. It's always great to see Victor. He's such a mensch. So this is a bit of an unusual topic today. It was spawned by a visit of mine to the National Building Museum. Other than Marcia, is there any other DC person here? Just a few? Okay. So I recently attended an exhibit at this wonderful National Building Museum entitled Making Room, Housing for a Changing America. Aside from the fact that it's an absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous architectural structure, worthy of a visit if you're in DC. The exhibit itself, which happens to be open through January of next year, January 6th, I think, is fascinating for anyone who is a part of the housing ecosystem, which is what we all are here. So the exhibit really got me thinking about housing in general, its design, its development, its use, flexibility, and adaptability, and the implications for women in the context of changing societal needs and trends. Excuse me. So when discussing diversity and inclusion of minorities and women, we often focus on inclusion in the workplace and in leadership roles. But since this is the year of women, and the fact that the exhibit really resonated with me, today I'm going to look at D&I, diversity and inclusion, from a different perspective, focusing on women in housing, both as professionals and primarily as consumers. And by extension, and you will see as I go along, economic opportunities that could arise for women, in particular relating to all aspects of housing. So this exhibit explores designs, bear with me 1 second. It explores designs for living spaces in the 21st century and allows visitors to find out how developers, architects, and interior designers are crafting very innovative and flexible housing concepts to meet the needs of a rapidly changing America. It features designs for open houses, and the exhibit also had adaptable living spaces. There was a 1,000 square foot space that you actually physically went into, and you were able to experience the adaptability of the various walls and the features. It was pretty fascinating. It was a house where, or not a house really, but space where it could accommodate contemporary demographic patterns and a cycle of generations from millennials in shared living spaces, which we all know about, especially in a high rent area, such as the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, where you have 5, 6 millennials all living together. We know that. So from millennials to multi-generational households where parents, children, and grandparents share a home with spaces that will adapt to the needs of all family members over time. So, given that changes in our housing needs are driven in large part by women consumers, these innovative designs prompted me to think about housing in a different way. If women were to design their own living spaces, and I should say our own living spaces, what would these spaces look like? So I'll start with some historical examples for both inclusion and exclusion of women in exercising true choice in our living spaces. And then I'll share some thoughts and ideas for the future, and many questions, I think, that have arisen from reading this exhibit. Women have an important role in the design and use of our living spaces, both as consumers and professionals, but men have typically determined housing for women. Yet, the influence of women is shaping our living spaces is not a novel concept. We've been doing this for thousands of years. Anthropologists have identified many matrilineal societies where the woman owns the dwelling property. An example being the Hopi Indians, for instance, where the names of male partners and offspring descend from the women, but the relationships were egalitarian. In the 19th century, a robust movement on women's rights emerged both in the US and abroad. These early feminists, involved in the cooperative movement of the time, had forward-looking ideas on how to free women from domestic duties. That sounds like music to my ears. One of these feminists, Harriet Beecher Stowe, secured her place in history as the author of, and we all know, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and for her leadership role in the Underground Railroad, which transported enslaved blacks from the South to the North. And by the way, I just finished a book called The Underground Railroad, written by Colson Whitehead, which was absolutely fabulous. I really learned so much from it, and Harriet Beecher Stowe was obviously clearly involved in that very important aspect of our history. So, consistent with Beecher Stowe's innate liberationist instincts, however, she was also active in the early feminist movement. Along with her sister, Catherine Beecher, she co-authored The American Women's Home, to elevate domestic work to an honorable place through remuneration and professionalization of domestic employment. Now, there is nothing, obviously, that is wrong with domestic work as a profession, but it needs to be paid. It needs to be, you need to receive compensation for it, clearly. So the Beecher sisters called for centralized public kitchens and cooperative childcare. Their underlying principle centered on the question, what must we do to promote families and equality in housing choice for all? They proposed many of the labor-saving kitchen designs we expect today, that we take for granted, such as continuous countertops and cupboards, as they're called. And many of these historical facts that I'm sharing with you today are actually taken from a book written by Dolores Hayden, The Grand Domestic Revolution, who herself was an architect and was is very steeped in the history of housing and the effects on women. In the 1930s, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the Beecher sisters' great niece, obviously this ran in the family, presented her ideas as utopian fiction novels in order to seed ideas without inviting a backlash, which would have been typical back in those days. Among her image of utopia was a house that did not include a kitchen. She was critical of detached dwellings and proposed centralized kitchens surrounded by kitchen-less cottages to develop a community, in essence, in an almost cooperative structure. That's what it takes. The Beecher's ideas gained popularity in the early 20th century, only to be abandoned during the Great Depression. In response to the dire housing conditions, President Hoover convened the National Conference on Home Building and Home Ownership, the theme being home ownership for men of sound character, with focus on single-family detached housing, naturally. At that conference, employers and unions came to an agreement that men were to be paid wages and women would not work but would be stay-at-home mothers, not to be paid, naturally. Men were to be the breadwinners. A measure of their success was that their wives did not need to work. And we know that that continues today, by choice in many instances, but not by choice in others. The conference participants also endorsed the Hoover administration's proposal for the Federal Home Loan Bank system, which is the system that FHFA regulates today and that I'm a part of. Not much later, Congress approved the FHA mortgage. In the post-World War II era, suburban homeownership through FHA and VA loans became the primary national housing policy. However, the GI Bill, which was passed in 1944, excluded women and people of color from obtaining a mortgage, although white women were able to be co-borrowers with their husbands. Women stayed at home in charge of all domestic duties. Manufacturers eagerly marketed time-saving equipment such as washing machines, televisions, and electrical appliances to the nation's housewives. Now, this, of course, doesn't even take into account what happened in the third world countries, right? I'm from Jamaica originally. I know my mother was actually washing clothes with her hands in the 70s. It wasn't until the mid-70s that she actually got a washing machine, which was just a fascinating object. It's like, whoa, something that actually washes clothes and you don't have to wring them, you don't have to scrub them. It was pretty fascinating. Suburbanization had its price, however. Women became isolated and their opportunities for personal autonomy were very limited. Suburban living involved coordinating all family and domestic tasks, which required multiple time-consuming commutes. Now, this may look old-fashioned, But I have to tell you, I hate the word housekeeper, but for shorthand, I actually have a housekeeper who does that. She actually sits there and she irons and she watches TV. However, I pay her $22 an hour. So hence the difference between that picture and the picture at my house today. I feel pretty good about that. I think $22 is pretty good, don't you? An hour? Yeah, no, that's right. But it's true, this work needs to be done.
I agree.
Right? I mean, there's honor in this work. Someone has to do this work, and why not someone who actually does get paid? Anyway. Blacks and Latinos were harmed by national suburbanization policies, no surprise there. Government policies for FHA loans included racially restrictive covenants. And I know that from personal experience because when my husband and I bought our house in 1992, the deed actually had a covenant in it, not enforceable at the time because of the laws that the Supreme Court had overturned that. But it specifically said people of non-Caucasian race could not live in that house. It also had something about cattle and livestock. You couldn't have cattle and livestock, which, they were essentially equating people of color and the livestock, and they both couldn't occupy the house. This was 1992. It was fascinating. And because of law, the deed has that as a running covenant throughout, even though it's not enforceable. Black service members were explicitly ineligible for VA mortgages and other benefits of the GI Bill. Pardon me. And under the Housing Act of 1954, which called for the eradication of blight, minority communities were demolished to make way for FHFA homes and commercial developments. Black women in public housing bore the brunt of federal and local policies. Public housing policies were characterized by deep and deliberate segregation, punitive welfare policies, government defunding and neglect of building maintenance, inadequate building designs, and lack of building security and police protection. In a number of cities, public housing was located in areas of concentrated poverty and racial segregation. Although public housing was legally desegregated in 1956, segregation persisted, and to a large extent it still does today. Not legally, naturally, but it does in practice. In Chicago, the great city where we find ourselves today, it wasn't until 1969, in the landmark case Hills versus Gautreaux, that a court ruling held in 1976 that the Chicago Housing Authority had systematically discriminated against blacks and therefore awarded them Section 8 vouchers to allow them to move to the suburbs as compensation for the housing project's substandard conditions in which they found themselves. The court ordered the integration of housing, and studies show that residents in desegregated communities had better outcomes as a result of the desegregation order. Older residents of public housing remember when public housing was a source of pride for black families. However, that changed relatively quickly. Punitive welfare policies contributed to the decline of the family. For example, in Missouri, a family with an able-bodied man was not eligible for public housing. The man had the choice of his family going without benefits or leaving them to find work at a time when discrimination was prevalent and factory jobs were disappearing and black men were not the first choice for men in general looking for work. Without her partner, a woman had a choice with a forced hand, working outside the home and not watching her children, or staying at home, only to be stigmatized as, you guess it, a welfare queen by public officials. In addition, private housing available to black families in Missouri was in short supply. In the name of urban renewal, long-standing black communities, such as Clayton, Missouri, have been raised to make way for commercial developments. In the 1950s, federal government policies promoted density in public housing to achieve economies of scale. Public housing became associated with high-rises, although most public housing was back then 1 to 4 story buildings. Pruitt-Egoe, Missouri consisted of 33 buildings with 11 stories, totaling close to 3,000 apartments. And this is very disturbing, but it's one of those things that it's a fact that we just live with. To encourage residents to walk between stairs, the elevators were designed not to stop at floors 7 through 11. Pruitt-Egoe, constructed in 1956, was imploded scarcely 16 years later. In 1972, the implosion of Pruitt-Egoe was televised live, leaving behind spectacular images for the nation to see. This only increased, naturally, the stigma of public housing. In the public's imagination, the design of the buildings was associated with social dysfunction. Building design was definitely a problem. High-rises without adequate elevator service made it difficult for women to watch their children. That's not really hard to believe, is it? However, the general decline of the city of St. Louis, which by 1972 had lost much of its population and manufacturing advantage, was a significant contributor to the societal challenges for families in Pruitt-Egoe. In Chicago, Cabrini Green, at its peak, Cabrini Green in Chicago, I remember the first time I came to Chicago in 1992, and accidentally walked through Cabrini Green. I found it to be fascinating, but it was just this massive cluster of these high-rise buildings that when you looked at it from the air, it was so overwhelming, and on the ground as well. But it had 3,600 units with over 20,000 people. One of the reasons given for the demolition of public housing was that the density of the high-rise units was because of the density of the high-rise units and concentrated poverty led to crime. Certainly, elevators and stairwells became danger zones for crime. However, as with Pruitt-Egoe, building design was not the fundamental reason for the decline of Cabrini Green. Rather, its location near a wealthy area, insufficient rental income, managerial and fiscal incompetence, and disinterested policing were at fault. Tenants strongly resisted the gradual demolition of Cabrini Green, to no avail, naturally. It was demolished. In the end, poor black women and children suffered most from displacement. Despite the one-to-one replacement policy requirement for public housing, few were able to live in the mixed income developments that replaced Cabrini Green. And we see actually the same thing in Washington, D.C. I live in the southwest quadrant of Washington. It's the tiniest quadrant of the 4 quadrants in Washington. And this particular quadrant underwent urban revitalization in the 50s, 60s, early 60s. And blacks who lived there were actually told that they would move away, but they would be able to come back and live in decent housing. And that never really occurred. It's pretty sad, but most of those folks moved to Prince George's County and were never given in Maryland, and were never given the opportunity to move back into the district.